Hey guys, and welcome to another DashFight video. Today, we'll conclude our long-winded trip into the world of Street Fighter's lore. In the first video, we discussed how Street Fighter got started, the amount of work that went into making the masterpiece that was Street Fighter 2, and the thinking behind the making of the Alpha series. But in this video, we'll take a look at the later Street Fighter games, some of the controversies, and what is next for the series from a story perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's get into it. So, Street Fighter 4, the game that has been hailed as the Lazarus game. The story of Lazarus can be found in the Holy Bible, and he was a friend of Jesus who died and was raised from the dead in what is considered Jesus' greatest miracle. In the same vein, the Street Fighter franchise, and fighting games in general, were considered to have run their course in the mid-2000s. Capcom had been hard hit as their titles, Street Fighter EX3 and Capcom Fighting Evolution, did not do well in the market. This caused Capcom to consider pulling out of the fighting game market in general. One of Capcom's legends, Yoshinori Ono, had already floated the idea of Street Fighter 4, but no one was listening. Thankfully, around that time, video games were losing their appeal in general, with developers and publishers more focused on creating graphical spectacles rather than games that people want to play again and again. So, people did what came naturally. They retreated to the games that had comforted them when they were younger. One of such was Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting, which was released in 2005 for PlayStation 2. It was a success, and this caused Capcom to realize that fans still loved their fighting games, just not the direction it was going at the time. This led to plans for Street Fighter 4 being greenlit, and the game went into production. In 2008, Street Fighter 4 was released, and it was a major success. It used more realistic designs, but also kept things whimsical enough to retain its charm. The backgrounds in Street Fighter 4 were done in 3D, and the art was beautiful. One of the factors people point to as the reason for Street Fighter 4's success was the cooperation between Capcom and a company called DIMS to develop the game. DIMS was a company made of former Capcom and SNK employees, and a lot of them had some experience with Street Fighter, including the man who was responsible for the very first Street Fighter game, Takashi Nishiyama. It also had a great cast of characters, including all the 12 original characters from Street Fighter 2, and they were joined by newbies Abel, El Fuerte, Hakan, and Sea Viper. While we saw the return of some other characters from other iterations of Street Fighter, like Gen from Street Fighter 1 and Alpha, Sakura and Dan from the Alpha series, Cammy, T-Hawk, Fei Long, and DJ from Super Street Fighter, in terms of gameplay, the game featured a lot of classic maneuvers and mechanics we were used to, but it also introduced focus attack and a revenge gauge. All these culminated to a great game that was universally praised by fans and critics alike, and it brought a new wave of interest into the competitive scene. This was also partly because for the first time, players could now face one another via LAN. This was pretty popular in Japanese arcades, where Street Fighter 4 was housed in Taito arcade cabinets, which came with network capabilities. The lore of Street Fighter 4 put it between Street Fighter 2 and 3. In this one, for the first time since Street Fighter 1, we had a new villain in Seth. Seth is technically a clone of Bison, specifically the 15, but he developed self-awareness and broke free, deciding to create his own network and ruling the world. His plan was to use the Shadaloo Intimidation Network, SIN, to create a machine which was called the Bleast Project. This would make it possible to download all of a fighter's capabilities and replicate them in Seth. His preferred vehicle to get this was another Street Fighter tournament, which was to have all the greatest fighters and then take their abilities. As it turned out, Bison, who had somehow survived his encounter with Akuma, was running the show from the sidelines. He wanted what Seth was after, but without having to do the dirty work himself. So, with Seth having done most of the work, Bison came simply to collect. He fought Seth and won. But it turns out there was another player in the shadows, Juri Han. She is a South Korean fighter whose father was murdered by Bison, and she swore revenge. Make no mistake, Juri is no angel. She joined SIN to get close to Seth and Bison, and was more than happy to collect all the female dolls that Bison had in earlier games procured. She was unable to get one though, Junie, who was saved by Cammy. On seeing that Seth had lost to Bison, she kills the clones. But not before Bison had activated the other Seths, which is what the other fighters got to face when up against the final boss. Another story element was the continued progress of Ryu, who was still battling with the Satsui no Hado. He entered into the tournament and eventually faced Seth. He won and destroyed the Bleast Project. and then escape the facility with Sakura, who had entered the tournament to meet him. On getting out, he would discover that his master, Goken, was alive and well. Apparently, the master had survived the Kuma's attack by emptying his soul via the power of nothingness. This means that both Bison and Goken survived the Kuma's attacks, which does not look good for the Raging Demon's impeccable track record of destruction. Goken explained that the power of nothingness was the only thing that could counteract the Satsui no Hado. He was able to seal the darkness in Ryu, only for Akuma to come back on the scene and challenge him to a duel. We do not see the winner, but we can say with some certainty that Akuma did not win, as Ryu is not a madman in Street Fighter V or 3. Also of note was the story of Balrog, who found a little boy called Ed in the ruins of the SIN complex and took him believing he would be a valuable asset somehow. This brings up an interesting prospect. If Ed was that young in Street Fighter 4, how much time passed before Street Fighter 5? We also met Abel, another Bison-failed clone who also appeared in Street Fighter 5 to take Bison down. We can say safely that by Street Fighter 4, Bison had amassed a fair few powerful enemies and would eventually lead to his downfall. A fun thing to note was the decision to name Seth. He was named partly as homage to Seth Killian, a former community manager at Capcom who is regarded highly by most people. Seth was initially going to be called Cain, making him rival to Abel. However, the name Seth was a better fit and still carried the necessary connotations, as Seth was the child born to Adam and Eve after the death of Abel. In other words, he was Abel's replacement, which is also true of Seth, who was to be the perfect creation by Shadowly. So, by the end of the story, Ryu had a bit of closure with the Satsui no Hado, and Ken, jeez, we forgot all about Ken. Well, he had become a responsible adult with a wife and son named Mel. He took part in a tournament because of his old friend Ryu, while the character Rufus was also added as a rival to Ken. A one-sided rivalry, however. And so, we move on to the next chapter, Street Fighter V. Street Fighter V is an amazing game. The balance is great, the cast of characters is memorable, and the gameplay is fun to watch. Unfortunately, it did not start that way. If anything, Street Fighter V will always be divisive, and it all stemmed from how it started. On the back of the success that was Street Fighter 4, Capcom could be forgiven for believing that Street Fighter V was going to be a slam dunk. This had a lot to do with how popular fighting games had become again, and Street Fighter 4 had been really instrumental in burgeoning a world of fighting game esports. So, it was understandable that Capcom wanted a game that would appeal to an esports audience. They also tried out a new formula, announcing that Street Fighter V would be a live service game. This meant that every character and costume could be grinded and obtained free of charge. Of course, there was still room to buy stuff, but this was a bold move from Capcom. Unfortunately, the rest of the game wasn't so well thought out. There were also whispers that the developers were given an impossible timeline so as to make it in time for the Capcom Pro Tour season. This led to a release that could only be kindly called a disaster. Street Fighter V released with no arcade mode, a small roster of characters, by modern standards anyways, and rubbish netcode. This took a while to get over and was never truly great, but as time went on, Capcom learned from their mistakes and developed Street Fighter V into a great game. But how did it hold up as a story? Well, the story mode of the game, which was called A Shadow Falls, gave us a lot of insight as to what happened within the story. As always, the main antagonist of the game was Bison, and this time, he had a new vice in the person of Fang, a psychotic killer who is hell-bent on elevating Bison as the leader of the world. To do this, he initiates a new project called Chains. Shadowloo sure loves their acronyms, which was to launch satellites called Black Moons into the sky and cause a worldwide EMP explosion and have the ensuing chaos feed Bison with unrivaled power. Fortunately for the protagonists, one of the hackers messed with the plan and sent the keys to satellites to fighters all over the world. One of the people who got a key was his close friend and series debutant, Rashid. Rashid tried to stop Chains by himself, but he was defeated and has his key stolen from him. However, there were two major teams after Bison. One is led by a mysterious woman named Helen, who by some enigmatic power was able to resurrect Charlie from the dead with the aim of defeating Bison. The other team was led by Karin Kanzuki, who used her vast resources to recruit several Street Fighter characters including Guile, Chun-Li, Birdie, and even Ken. Ryu's supposed to be in the party, but he is dealing with the Satsui no Hado again, which has come back to haunt him. So, Ken goes in his stead, and Ryu travels to find a way to deal with the darkness taking over him. It is while he is searching for answers with Dalsim that he encounters the ancient Aztec warrior called Necali. This shadowy figure is a Wrath-like character who roams about seeking the hearts of powerful warriors to devour. He defeats Ryu, but is stopped by Dalsim, who fights him off. The Helen team recruits Rashid, Juri, and eventually Cammy, while the Karen team is joined by Zangief and Armika. The teams are eventually able to break into Shadaloo's hideout seeking to destroy the Chains project, and they get into a flurry of fights. The Helen team fight Fang and a bunch of brain-controlled dolls and are able to defeat them. Meanwhile, Rashid is able to destroy the Black Moons, but Fang ensured that all the satellites would explode within 24 hours, which would bring untold chaos and tragedy and also boost Bison's power. Ryu finally joins the fray, and with the help of Charlie's sacrifice, he's able to defeat Bison for the last time. With Bison defeated and the Chains project destroyed, it spelled the end of the evil tyranny of Shadaloo. Helen would later be revealed to be a minor character from Street Fighter 3 called Colleen, who is the assistant to the game's villain, Gil. It was revealed that Gil's organization, the Illuminati, are the main shadow organization of the whole story. With Bison supposedly out of the way, Gil and co now go ahead to build what they say will be their utopia. Ryu has mastered the use of the power of nothingness, so the Satsui no Hado is no longer a problem. Charlie dies, while Cammy is on the run from her sister Decapre. The death of Bison is interesting, as the Mad Dictator will not appear in Street Fighter 3 and has also been missing so far in Street Fighter 6. There was also the story of Ed, who first appeared in Street Fighter 4 and was taken in by Balrog. He is warned by Rose's assistant, Manat, that he has trouble ahead, so he along with his sister figure, Falk, form Neo Shadaloo, which is committed to finding victims of Shadaloo and helping them. They also have a huge gorilla on their side. That was the story of Street Fighter 5, and whether it was smooth or not, it did line up pretty well with the next game on the timeline. That's an exaggeration, but also not really, because going by the sales numbers at the time, not many people played Street Fighter 3. This was for a number of reasons. One aspect was the team. Street Fighter 3 was to be the follow-up to the wildly successful Street Fighter 2. But, as it turned out, the small team put together to create the new game were not very experienced. In fact, it has been said that about 80% of the team didn't know much about fighting games. The driver for the game was Tomoshi Sadamoto, who had worked on the King of the Dragon game. And while he had some fresh ideas for Street Fighter 3, it was a very uncomfortable time for him. It didn't help that the experienced heads within the company had either left or were working on Street Fighter Alpha, and for some weird reason, both teams did not share intel. This lack of experience and information meant that Street Fighter 3 was already in a bad place. However, this wasn't the only reason, as with Street Fighter Alpha, there was also some inexperience. But that turned out great. But with Street Fighter 3, the timing also coincided with a real drop in arcade culture all around the world. More and more people were playing on home consoles, and Street Fighter 3 was a game made for the arcades. It was running on Capcom's CP3 arcade system, which no home console at the time could handle. There was a philosophical divide here in that a lot of the developers were people who had a fondness for arcade culture and were aspiring to make a game that elevated that way of life. However, consumers had moved and competitors were more willing to adapt. Worse still, it came out just as Virtua Fighter 3 and Tekken 3 also made their debuts, and the emphasis on 3D animation at the time meant that Street Fighter 2's gorgeous 2D animations just weren't alluring to the public who deemed them archaic. Furthermore, Street Fighter 3 was a game for hardcore fans, and many of the systems weren't understood by casual players, meaning that even those interested soon grew frustrated at their lack of expertise at the game. Perhaps the biggest issue with Street Fighter 3 was the roster. The full name of the game was Street Fighter 3 New Generation, and as the name implies, it really was a new generation of fighters. In the initial stages of the game, even Ken and Ryu had been thrown out, and we were instead presented with a weird array of characters who had no priors in the Street Fighter universe. Interestingly, the game wasn't even supposed to be a Street Fighter game, but when industry legend Akira Yasuda saw the problems the development team was encountering, he suggested that Ryu be added and the game be made a Street Fighter game. Street Fighter 3 sold poorly, but it would get a redemption arc as time went on. Street Fighter 3 Second Impact and Third Strike were released with updated balancing, new characters, Chun-Li and Akuma were particularly welcomed, and just the passage of time meant that the people would be a bit more receptive. The last point on time was perhaps the most important factor. As people fell out of love with the frankly ugly early 3D era, the beauty of Street Fighter 3 became more evident. With Street Fighter 3, the story of the development process is particularly pivotal as it really shaped the lore and is the reason it is the last game in the timeline. A new cast of characters meant that there was a new protagonist, Alex. As a protagonist, Alex wasn't great, and the absence of most of the legacy characters we were used to meant that the story had to take place in the future. So, what was this story? Remember that lore-wise, Bison is supposedly gone for good, Ryu has mastered the power of nothingness, and Shadaloo's power has been shattered. Therefore, a new evil entity needed to replace the old guard. This was the Illuminati, headed by Gil. Most of the story for Street Fighter 3 came from Second Impact, which retconned a lot of what happened in New Generation, while Third Strike just sought to put a bow on things. As mentioned earlier, the big new bad guy was Gil, whose sole aim was to create a utopia made up of the worthy. According to the Illuminati's beliefs, there was to be an apocalypse and the ones who remain had to be warriors. To ensure this, the Illuminati set about achieving what they'd call the G Project. Also, Gil set up a tournament to figure out those who would inhabit his utopia. One of those who came for the fight was Alex, whose mentor Tom had been beaten to the point of death by Gil. Alex got his revenge, which caused Gil to develop an interest in him. Within the Illuminati, there was some politicking going on as Gil's brother, Urien, was plotting to be the divine leader in place of Gil. This would not work, and in a cruel turn of events, Urien would confront Gil, win, but only because Gil wanted it to, become the president of the Illuminati, only to be informed that Gil was now the emperor, which was again a step ahead of Urien. Gil's intentions are a lot less malicious compared to Bison, but he was a dangerous proponent nonetheless. Meanwhile, Ryu is once again on his travels where he meets an old hermit named Oro, who is extremely powerful and comments that with more training, decades worth, he might be able to stand against him at full strength. Ken returns to meet with Ryu again, and he even takes a new student under his wing, Sean. But it must be said, Sean is not a very strong character. The only other character of note lore-wise is Q. This is a mysterious character who is under investigation for some murders, but at the end of the day, nothing is known about Q. Of course, there have been some parallels and comparisons to G from Street Fighter V, but nothing concrete. It is unlikely that they are the same person, but it is highly likely that they are related somehow. By the end of Third Strike, Akuma is still looking for a worthy opponent, Ryu is seeking strength, and Ken has found fulfillment as a martial arts master and father, husband, and entrepreneur. For all intents and purposes, Third Strike is not a bad end to the Street Fighter series, but there is so much more to uncover. And that's it from us. Personally, I have never been more happy to be a fighting game fan, and the potential of the genre during this period is unlimited. I hope for more tournaments, more players, more fans, more cohesive storytelling, and greater communities. Street Fighter 6 will bring so many people together, and I am so excited to see it. And for us here at DashFight, we will have several videos covering the game, so you can look forward to that. But until the next video, I've been Jammers, and do take care.